Assalamu alaikum. So I wanted to share with you again a few extracts from the book, The Sayings and Wisdom of Imam Ali. And today I want to read from the chapter entitled The Promised Day of Return and a few sayings of Imam Ali about death. Bismillah. Increase your remembrance of death and of the day you will come out from your graves and of the day you will stand before Allah, the Mighty, the Majestic, and calamities will be lessened for you. Visit graves, and by this remind yourself of the next world. Wash the dead, and your heart will be moved, for an empty body is a profound lesson. Pray over the dead, and perhaps it will make you sad, for surely the sad person is close to Allah. When giving instructions to his son Hassan, Imam Ali said, "O my son, increase your remembrance of death, and remember what you will enter into, and what you will be led to after your death, so that when it comes to you, you are well prepared and well fortified against it, so that it will not come upon you suddenly and catch you unaware. I advise you to remember death and to avoid being forgetful of it. How can you be forgetful of something that will not forget you? How can you put your hopes in something that will not give you any respite?" Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Bismillah, this is a dua Yom al-Khamis, the supplication for Thursday from Imam Ali Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam. In the name of God, the All-Merciful, the All-Compassionate, praise belongs to God, who has taken away the shadowy night by his power and brought the sight-giving day through his mercy. He has clothed me in his brightness and given me its favor. O God, just as thou hast spared me for this day, so also spare me for its likes. Bless the Prophet Muhammad and his household. Torment me not in it and other nights and days by allowing me to commit unlawful acts and to clothe myself in sins. Provide me with its good, the good of all within it and the good of everything after it, and turn away from me its evil, the evil of all within it and the evil of everything after it. O God, by the protective compact of Islam, I seek mediation with Thee. By the inviolability of the Quran, I rely upon Thee. By Muhammad the Chosen, God bless him and his household, I seek intercession with Thee. So recognize my protective compact by which I hope my need will be granted. O most merciful of the merciful, O God, decree for me on Thursday 5 things which none embraces but Thy generosity, and none supports but Thy favors. Health, through which I may have the strength to obey Thee. Worship, by which I may deserve Thy plentiful reward. Plenty in my state through lawful provision, and that Thou makest me secure in the places of fear through Thy security, and placest me in the fortress against the striking of worries and sorrows. Bless Muhammad and his household, and make my seeking his mediation as an intercessor give profit on the day of resurrection. Surely, Thou art the most merciful of the merciful. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad.
برائے خوشنود امام زمانہ بلند تر صلوات
بس مل کر بلند آواز سے درود بھیجیے.
صلی علی محمد
کر حسین اسی میں نجات ہے کر مدحت حسین اسی میں نجات ہے دنیا بے سواد کو ان سے سواد ہے بے عیب حق کی ذات ہے یا ان کی ذات ہے قول ان کا اور کلام خدا ایک بات ہے کس منزل نیاز کے سالک حسین ہیں کس منزل نیاز کے سالک حسین ہیں جب تک خدا کا ملک ہے مالک حسین ہیں کر مدحت حسین درود ہے امام والے امام ایک مرتبہ مل کر بلند آواز سے درود بھیجیں چند اشعار مولا علی کی شان میں علی ہیں بت شکندوش نبی پر اپنے پا رکھے علی ہیں بت شکندوش نبی پر اپنے پا رکھے زمین کعبہ دیتی ہے صدا ان کو خدا رکھے علی ہیں بت شکندوش نبی پر اپنے پار رکھے چلو شان علی کعبے میں دیکھو غل ہے بندوں میں چلو شان علی کعبے میں دیکھو غل ہے بندوں میں قدم دوش نبی پر ہے ولی خدا رکھے علی ہیں بت شکندوش نبی پر اپنے پار رکھے نجف سے ہو کے آتے ہیں اجل رضوان سے کہہ دینا نجف سے ہو کے آتے ہیں اجل رضوان سے کہہ دینا ہمارے واسطے دروازے جنت کھلا رکھے علی ہیں فاتحہ یوں رقم کرتا ہے اب راوی مغموم زدے یوں رقم کرتا ہے اب راوی مغموم حزین ایک دولہا لیے جاتا تھا برات اپنی کہیں وہ بے قلبی تھا لقب تھا وہ غلام شہیدی دور سے اس کو نظر آ گئی مقتل کی زمین دل پہ شبیر کے ماتم کا اثر ہونے لگا دیکھ کر گنج شہیدہ کی طرف رونے لگا ایک زمیندار کھڑا تھا یہ کیا اس سے کلام کس کی یہ فوج ہے کس کے ہیں لاشیں یہ تمام یہ جو زخمی ہے کھڑا لاکھوں میں کیا اس کائنات رو کے وہ شخص پکارا کے ہے رونے کا مقام ہے یہ جلاد جو کھینچے ہوئے شمشیریں ہیں اور زہرا کے مرقع کی یہ تصویریں ہیں اور یہ مظلوم جو کھاتا ہے کھڑا نیزوتے ہے سخی ابن سخی اور امیر ابن امیر وطن آوارہ مصیبت زدہ بے کس دل گے ہے یہی 3 شب و روز کا پیاسا شبیر اب تلک صبح سے لوٹا گیا باغ زہرا، اب یہ بے رحم بجھاتے ہیں چراغ زہرا۔ یوں تو ایک ظلم سے ایک ظلم ہوا شے پہ سوا، تین صدموں میں مگر صبر کا یارانہ رہا، تین صدموں میں مگر صبر کا یارانہ رہا۔ ایک جوان اس کا بھتیجا تھا حسن کا بیٹا، لاش پامال ہوئی اس کی بھی وہ قتل ہوا، اس کے مرنے کے خبر شہر نے جو پہنچائے تھے، ننگے سر مادر خیمے پہ چلی آئی تھی۔ دوسرا غم یہ ہے ایک بھائی تھا اس کا صفدر، جب سے وہ مر گیا سیدھی نہیں ہوتی ہے کمر، اب بھی روتا ہے اسے ہائے برادر کہہ کر، بے کفن لاش وہ اس کی ہے پڑی دریا پر، ابھی یہ لاش عجب درد سے چرائی تھی، لڑکی ایک ہائے چچا کہہ کے جو چلائی تھی۔ تیسرا حادثہ میں کیا کہوں پھٹتا ہے جگر، اس کا ایک بیٹا تھا 18 برس کا اکبر، برچھیوں سے ابھی مارا گیا رن میں وہ پسر، حیف ہے دفن ہوئی رات کو جس کی مادر، غم اکبر میں اسے کیا کہوں کیوں کر دیکھا، سب نے میدان میں زینب کو کھلے سر دیکھا، سب نے میدان میں زینب کو کھلے سر دیکھا، یوں رقم کرتا ہے۔
صلی اللہ علیہ یا رسول اللہ وعلى أهل بيتك المظلومين، صلى الله عليك يا أبا عبد الله وعلى الأرواح التي حلت بفنائك، عليك مني سلام الله أبدا ما بقيت وبقي الليل والنهار، ولا جعله الله الآخر لحدي مني لزيارتكم. السلام على الحسين وعلى علي بن الحسين وعلى أولاد الحسين وعلى أصحاب الحسين، ويا ليتنا كنا معكم سادتي فنفوز فوزا عظيما. صل على محمد وعلى آله. Two narrations of a very different type. The first one is probably a very famous one, so much so that the initial phrase of it became the name of a famous maqtal in the 19th century. And this is the narration from Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. The breath, an-nafas, the breath of one who feels grief at the injustice subjected to us, and feels grief at the oppression to which we have been subjected, is a tasbih, its glorification of God. And the grief that such a person feels for us is an act of worship. And his concealing our secrets is jihad in the path of God. This is a very famous narration. And what it shows you is that our conception of what it is that we're doing is actually far greater than perhaps what we ourselves understand. So much so that after this, the Imam actually said something very interesting. He said, this ought to be written in gold. Write this in gold, adorn it in your houses, treasure it. This is a very important thing. The breath of someone who feels grief is like the glorification of God. The oppression that is afflicted to us when people feel saddened by this, it's an act of worship. And when they hold fast to our wilaya and protect our secrets, it is like striving in the path of God, like jihad. This is a very profoundly important hadith, which in many ways encompasses almost every aspect of our life. Another hadith, which is perhaps maybe less well known, but what it indicates is the way in which, as I've been trying to suggest, Karbala exists beyond our normal conception of history, beyond our normal conception of space and time. We see Karbala as something that we make present now and is present to us, and it's a certain historical event that we commemorate. But this is something which has been commemorated many times before. I mentioned the commemoration by the Prophet, but here is another one which indicates something very interesting, and it links to, for example, Ziyarat al-Warith, when we talk about how the Imam represents the inheritance of the prophets. And the narration is this. This is Amir al-Mu'mineen says this, reports this to Ibn Abbas. And again, it's interesting. Amir al-Mu'mineen is reporting it. Remember what I said about Amir al-Mu'mineen as the secret of all the prophets. He reports, one day, Jesus was passing Karbala. Jesus. And he sat down and he began to weep. And his disciples also sat down with him. They were observing what he did, and they also started to weep. And they were weeping for quite a while, but they didn't understand the reason for this. And so they said, Ya Ruhullah, O Spirit of God, of Jesus, what is it that makes you weep in this place? And Jesus says, do you not know what this land is? And they said, no. And he said, this is Karbala. This is the land on which the son of the Prophet Ahmad will be killed. We actually have some interesting narrations about the association of Jesus with Karbala. We have narrations, for example, that Jesus was actually born in Karbala. And his association with the Aza of the Imam is one which begins with his birth. So for example, the Quran famously says that Mary went out of the temple and she went to an eastern place, so east of Jerusalem. And as I said, we have narrations which say that place east of Jerusalem was Karbala, and it makes sense. Karbala is east of Jerusalem. But what it's really indicating is this link that the Imam has with all the prophets. And it's showing you the centrality of this event, the centrality of this narration, the centrality of this memory in the entirety of human history, in the entirety of human sacred history. Now, I want to continue our discussion about the nature of walaya and presence and memory. But I just want to start with something perhaps a bit more trivial, to give you a sense in which presence is something which, wherever presence, for example, of that which is not near to us physically, is something we're very familiar with. And we're very familiar with because of the simple device, a smartphone, which almost everyone has. One of the functions of a smartphone is it makes things which are far near. You can watch things which are happening many, thousands of miles away. You can get a live feed, for example, to Karbala. You can see exactly what's happening in Karbala right now. You can do the same thing during Hajj. All sorts of things are made present to us through this. So the idea of that kind of ever-presence of things which are not close in space and time is not unusual. The difference is that this particular device has no morality. There's no value associated with it. It's not telling you to do things which are right or wrong. It's not telling you what is right or wrong. It can have certain kinds of controls which you set up for it, but these controls are broadly speaking devoid of any morality. It's not taking you on a path of perfection. It's not providing you with a certain path to salvation. And that's precisely the way in which walaya does this, in a way which actually doesn't require this sort of technology. This sort of technology tends to be dehumanizing in so many different ways. And I don't want to, get into that question. But what I wanted to show you is that there are other ways in which we can understand how presence from far in time and space works. But it works with a very different aim, and it works with a very different destination and goal in mind. And so what I want to do in the next couple of days is to discuss two actual kind of philosophical ideas, but two models that we can compare walaya as presence to make sense of what it is that we are doing when we enact walaya as presence, but also what does this ask of us. So they're both, broadly speaking, engaged with the question of ethics, or how do we understand what we owe each other, what we owe ourselves, and also what we owe to the Imam. So this is the next step of what I want to take us, because thus far we've been really talking about what walaya is with respect to the Imam, and all we've really said is that the response requires us to be mu'mineen who are mumtahan, who are tested, whose hearts are tested by God for faith. But we haven't necessarily said what that actually means. What are the moral imperatives? What is even the moral landscape which that might entail? What is that particular path? The Imam's taking us by the hand on a particular path towards a particular goal. What is that path? What are the steps and the practices along that path? And it's also an understanding that this reception of or understanding of walaya as presence entails within it a notion of what is the good life. And that what is the good life, as I've said before as well, bears within it the idea of what is the good death. They work side by side. Because the death of this body in this life is a particular kind of death, but it's a punctuation along a longer trajectory of what life is. Life does not end with the death of this body, the death of our bodies. We continue to live, and we continue to live into the hereafter. And sometimes, just to kind of, again, maybe this is a bit flippant, but when I was thinking about this, I was reminded of this very famous slogan that we all grew up with. And you've got T-shirts which have this written on them. And it says things like, live like Ali and die like Hussein, right? Very famous slogan. And in some ways the sentiment is a very nice sentiment. But it's also a sentiment which reflects our shortcoming. It reflects our shortcoming because what is the difference between the life and death of Ali and Hussein? There is no difference. They were exemplary in both ways. The death of their bodies is exemplary. The death of their lives that they lived, the lives that they articulated and demonstrated are both exemplary. So in some ways it's kind of a weird statement that people have, not least because we're all familiar with a very famous hadith which starts with awwalana Muhammad, awsatana Muhammad, akhirana Muhammad, kullana Muhammad. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل. And so making this kind of distinction doesn't really help. It's a bit like when people make the distinction between Imam Hassan and Hussein as if they were doing different things. They're not doing different things. They're acting in ways which are particular to their time, but their trajectory of their understanding of their life and where they're taking people and their death, the death of their bodies is the same. There's no difference in it. There's no conflict in it. This is not the way we see who the Ahlul Bayt are. So coming to these two models, as I said, of which we can compare Walayah's presence to. The first one is something which I've already kind of mentioned in passing a few times, the idea of a way of life. And in particular, this is actually philosophy as a way of life, but even if we put philosophy on the side, a way of life, what does a way of life actually entail? Now, the theory I'm using is one of a very famous modern French philosopher, Pierre Hadot, who died in 2010. And he came up with this model of what does a philosophy of, as a way of life entail? What are the features of it? And he was interested in two types of questions. He was interested in what is it that the modern world has lost in terms of how they see the world? What is it that the modern world has lost? How is it that, we have a concern with critique? We're very critical of each other. We're very critical of everything that's given to us. It's considered to be a modern thing that you should always be fighting back and criticizing and objecting. We tend to have a very narrow, rather narcissistic concern with ourselves, not necessarily with others, not necessarily in the wider context we find ourselves. And that notion of that self itself tends to be very material. It's our material presence that is our concern. And also our aspirations tend to be very material. The question is, what is our greater aspiration? Understanding the nature of reality, understanding life. Where is that gone? And what Hadot suggested is that this is just not what was true of the ancient world. In the ancient world, the idea was that the way in which you understood reality was important because your understanding was a way of curing yourself. It was a therapy. Just as a physician would treat the body, the role of philosophers was to treat your soul so that you could have a sound idea of what the nature of reality is. And so there was a way of life was a therapy, and also it was a path to salvation. It had a very clear idea that you have a certain goal to which you want to get to. It was the notion that knowledge and learning were transformative. They were transformative. They were not just about making changes in yourself, because a change can be for the good or for the worse. It could be for the better or for the worse. But transformation is where you're moving towards the better, to what is the good, towards some sort of salvation. And this is very much, this notion of the transformation which is happening in yourself is very akin to this notion that we have in the very famous Quranic verse in Surah Al-Jumu'ah about what the function of the Prophet is. The function of the Prophet is that he purifies yourselves. He does the tazkiyat of your nafs. He teaches you the kitab and he teaches you hikmah. He purifies yourself, he teaches you the scripture, and he teaches you hikmah. And there's a huge topic about what hikmah is. But what that suggests precisely is this notion that the role of the Prophet, and then of course the role of the Imam after, is to effect this transformation in you. As I was saying yesterday, when people encountered the Prophet and when they encountered the Imam, it was an awesome encounter. It changed their lives. It changed the way they saw the world. It opened their eyes. Now, there are three particular things, aspects of this way of life that Ado mentions, which I think are interesting and salient, and I'll try to also suggesting ways in which I think it doesn't go far enough. The first, which is really important, is that the way of life requires following someone. You can't just embark on the way of life yourself. You don't just decide on your own particular path. You have to follow someone. And you have to follow someone who is a sage. So the term for this in Arabic would be a hakim. If I were to use the language of our hadith, it would be the idea of the alim rabbani. The alim who is taught by the Rabb, by God. And the sage has certain features. First of all, the sage has a certain inner, what you might call tranquility and freedom, a sukoon in the self. A base from which they can act and they can teach. You know, one of the problems often discussed extensively in psychology is that one of the ways in which you can kind of see the chaos of a life is the chaos which is inside. Lots of different voices, lots of different ideas going around, no clear order in which things are being thought, all sorts of ideas. You know, we're familiar with this idea, for example, that when we pray, the idea, you know, we want to be focusing on our prayer, but prayer is precisely when we remember all sorts of things. You know, where do you leave the keys? Did I park somewhere? You know, something that you were thinking about work-wise, it suddenly comes into your mind. All sorts of things come into your mind about your life, about your family, and so forth. And this is a feature of our everyday life. We have always these thoughts coming in. The feature of a sage is that there is a tranquility at the heart of it. And that tranquility then allows that person to act with purpose and with a certain maturity and integrity. Quite simply because it's, you know, for example, in the Buddhist tradition, this is known as the notion of emptying. Emptying so that you can really understand things. Having that basic tranquility. The second one is that peace of mind is extended to the presence of the heart to something which is greater. This is precisely this notion of the huzur al-qalb. And what is greater, and third element of being the sage, is to have what Ado calls a cosmic consciousness. A sage is one who can see the world as God sees the world. And again, you know, who better to see the world as God sees the world than the wali, than the face of God himself. So these features of the sage, I think, are very interestingly familiar to how we might understand the way in which the imam or the wali acts as someone whose guidance we seek if we want to embark on this particular way of life. But there are certain things which are missing from this account of Ado's. It seems to be a very cold account of the sage. It doesn't give you a sense of the caring and the nurturing nature of the sage. You're unlikely to follow a particular way of life and follow an individual at the heart of that if you have no affective, no emotional connection to them. And this is precisely where the Imam's nature as someone who is an attractive individual, as someone who has a caring nature, has a nurturing nature, is an expression of the divine presence, including the divine names of the loving, the nurturing, the caring, and is then an expression of divine providence. Has a care for where you are day to day. It's not just someone who's teaching you in a cold manner, but someone who's actually then following, as I said, is taking you by the hand. But on that journey, it's not just a journey of silence in which it's a one-way instruction. The individual is listening to you so they can take you in the best possible route to that journey. And the reason why this caring sense is important is because one of the things that we're told is that the core of our faith is love. It's love and compassion. You know, we have the famous hadith, you know, what is the deen except for hub, for love. We also have, you know, very famous hadith Qudsi where God says, you know, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known. So there's a sense in which love is something which is hardwired into us as humans, and it's what connects us, and it what connects us to the idea of what our purpose is. And our purpose then leads us to this way of life and leads us to the sage. And just to say a bit more about this notion of the sage as an alim rabbani, or as someone who truly knows and his knowledge comes from the Rabb, from God. There's a very famous saying of Amir al-Mu'mineen that there are three types of people. And there are many different versions of this. One is the alim rabbani, one is the muta'allim, the one who is learning on the path to salvation, ala sabil al-najat it says. And the other one, the third category, in some hadith they call the juhal, the ignorant. In this version they're called the hamajra'a, which is a kind of a pejorative term. It means the kind of the rabble, and they are categorized by the fact that they're constantly chattering, and they're chattering with anyone. They have no discernment about who they should be with. One of the important points of this path of walaya is that you have to be discerning in whose company you keep, whose friendships you nurture, quite simply because you want to keep the friendship and the company of those who are truly living and who inspire in you life to progress on this particular journey to a destination. And those are people who actually know, who are on this path of knowing, and who are, like you, attached to that particular walaya. The alim rabbani is the one who bears the knowledge of the prophets and is divinely inspired. That's the very notion of the alim rabbani at the heart of it. So the first stage is this notion of a sage. A way of life entails following a sage. The second, which is very obvious, is that there has to be a community that does this. You do this within a community. And for Pierre Hadot, this is the community of the sage. Now, the problem with Hadot's theory is that it's quite restricted, because he's thinking of like a group, you know, living in a particular space and following the precepts and the practices of a particular teacher. What our particular path and our notion of the sage is doing is it's taking us far beyond that and saying, your community is wherever the Ahlul Walaya are. Whoever professes that walaya, that's your community. Regardless of, you know, if you might have differences of opinion with them, you might have different kinds of training, you might have different social standings and so forth. It's irrelevant. You're attached to those people because you follow the same sage. You follow the same alim rabbani. And your practices are similar. It's a bit like, and you don't have to be in a particular, for example, a monastery or a commune or something like that, because again we have lots of hadith on this about how, you know, the way you are ascetic, a zahid, is you are a zahid in the world. You don't have to withdraw from the world. You don't need to do that. And one of the key practices that are in the community, and this is something that Hadot says about his particular community, is those who are following the sage are ever watchful about what they do. And they account for themselves at the end of the day. Now this is what in our tradition is known as muhasabah. It's known as the muhasabat al-nafs. And this is something which is, there's a watchfulness, a muraqabah, but there's also a muhasabat al-nafs at the end of the day. And on this question of muhasaba and comportment within the community, we have a very rich tradition. But I'm just going to mention two or three very small hadith on this, short hadith on this. One is the way in which we deal with one another within this community. So Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, he mentions various things. One is, he is not of our Shia who does not control his anger. Because we know anger leads to conflict and anger leads to a certain blindness. You know, as I said, the whole point of being on this path of walaya is that the Imam opens your eyes. And if you allow anger then to close your eyes and to become blinded, then you're negating that. And it leads you to do things which you shouldn't do. It leads you to behave badly with others. And we know that one of the things that the Ahlul Bayt always did was they were about nurturing people who are true, are, as they would say, an ornament to them, because they behave in a way that they are exemplary. They exemplify the exemplariness of the Ahlul Bayt themselves. Another one he says is, you are not of our Shia if you do not keep counsels, if you do not honor trusts, if you don't keep your amanat. And of course, amanat here means many things. It means the actual things. Someone might have given you something to keep as a trust, and then you have to return it. But the most important amana, of course, is if someone says something to you, keeping a secret. We know, that, as I mentioned in the first hadith at the beginning, kitman as-sir, keeping the secret, keeping people's counsels and advice secret, if they've told you to do so, is a duty that you have. And it's showing you how the social cohesion of that particular community works. There's also sayings like, you're not one of us if you do not honor your elders, if you do not show compassion and mercy to the young, if you are not dutiful and caring towards your neighbors, and so forth. But the one which I really wanted to mention, which I think is wonderful, and it comes back to this question of the muhasabat al-nafs, the accounting of the self, is you're not of our Shia if you do not account for yourself in the way that at the end of your day you feel as if you are presenting your acts to us. So your a'mal, at the end of the day, your muhasabah is as if you are presenting your a'mal to the Imam. Now why is this the case? It's because it's like, we often think about that, what would the Imam think? Or what would the Imam feel if you knew I said this or I did this? So it's putting that moral compass into your hearts and saying, account for yourself in the way as if you have to then account to us by presenting your deeds to us in that particular way. And it's developing that particular relationship as well. And there are many other aspects of that, but I just want to move on to the third aspect of this way of life, which Addo discusses. And in some ways it's a very obvious one, which is that the way of life is about establishing a community which follows a particular sage. So what does a community do beyond these kind of moral connections we have? The community requires spiritual practices. Spiritual practices is the phrase that he uses. And the examples he gives are things like conversing, arguing, debating, reading, writing. The one which is important here is emulating. And I'm going to say more about this tomorrow. One of the features of the community's spiritual practice is to emulate the sage, to live in the present, to reflect upon death. We heard this earlier in those hadith about Amir al-Mu'mineen saying, reflect upon death. Reflect upon death, have an exercise of dying. There's a famous saying, die before you die. The reason for doing this is because you will be aware of the mortality of your body, but also understand that this is not the end. This is a particular path, but you have a limited time in which you have to develop your relationship with the sage so that you achieve success in this world and the hereafter. And of course, I would say that, there are many other spiritual practices which go far beyond the ones that he mentions in this work. There's other ones like what in Arabic is known as tahqiq, the idea of realizing something. Realization here means a number of different things. One could be a realization of an understanding of a particular kind of argument so that you know the truth of it. Realization could be the realization of a particular virtue or trait, such as honor, courage, justice, and so forth. And beyond that, there are many others, spiritual exercises, which you're very familiar with, things like zikr in the form of the invocation of the divine names and other kinds of repetitions and litanies. The recitation of the Quran, of course, pilgrimage, acts of pilgrimage as spiritual practices, the composition and recitation of poetry, and on pilgrimage and recitations of poetry I'll say something further later in these nights. And of course the aza itself. The aza itself as a fundamental type of spiritual practice that this particular community engages in. And I want to just bring you back to this question of who are these people who are then being engaged in this particular way of life, who are being transformed by this sage, by this imam, on this particular path. And that's precisely where the lessons that we have from those who are at Karbala is so important, and it comes up again and again, because they're the ones who are transformed. We can separate out, say, the family members, because they're ones who have been with them right from the beginning. We can even separate out some of the very old friends. So in some ways, the musibah of someone like Habib ibn Madahir, who is an old friend, is a different one because he's like family. So much so that, as you know, those who have been to Karbala will know that when you enter the haram, he's there, right there. He's there. You have to go through a Habib if you want to go to Imam. But what about those who actually had just a fleeting glimpse of the Imam? And we heard in the Marsiya earlier, one of the most famous examples is this young man, Abdullah ibn Wahb al-Kalbi, who was a young Christian man who had just been married, and he was in a state of confusion because he found out something was going on and he felt something deeply wrong was going on. And he went to the Imam. And when he went to the Imam, he was there with his mother and with his new bride. And he was from, as I said, a Christian background. He had nothing to do with what was going on, and yet he felt the desire to be engaged in this. He asked for the Imam's permission. There's a famous thing where his wife says to him, I will only let you go and fight if you can guarantee to me that I will be in paradise with you afterwards. I want the Imam to guarantee this. I mean, in such a short time, they already understood what the Imam was. The Imam can guarantee that. They understood that already. And we also know that when he went then out to fight in the battlefield, people from the army, the Kufan army, treated him badly because they said, "You're a Christian, what have you got to do with this? Go away from him." They didn't take him seriously. But when he started killing their forces, they started taking him seriously. And they did what was often done with most of the ashab of the Imam, and then later with the family of the Imam. When they could not compete with them one-on-one, they attacked them from all sides. with many men, people hitting with swords, firing arrows, throwing lances and spears at them, until eventually he was killed. And we have the story also of when his head was severed and was thrown towards the camp, saying, "This is a gift to the mother of this young Christian boy." The mother then sent it back saying, "I have sacrificed him for God. We don't give the sacrifices back. We don't take the sacrifices back. This is a sacrifice we have already given." And then beyond that, we have many, many examples. We have the examples of the ashab who remembered the time of Dhuhr. And then when the Imam was praying, they stood in front of him, because the Kufan army would not stop fighting. And every time an arrow would come towards the Imam and those who were praying with him, they would take the arrows on their bodies, and they would not drop until the Imam had finished his prayer. And then eventually they would die on the field like that. And many other examples. I just want to give you one other example, which is a famous one, and it's of Nafi ibn Halab. Nafi was someone who had been a companion of the Imam's father, had been at Siffin as well. He was an old companion of his. And we know that on the night of Ashura, when the candles had been put out, and the Imam said, "Go wherever you want," he was one of the first to say, "Imam, we cannot leave you. If you want, we will go with you to the east or the west, but we will never leave you. As long as my sword is sharp, I will always fight and defend you." And later in the night, after the test of the ashab, as we call it, we have the famous story that the Imam was going into the battlefield at night, and he heard steps coming behind him, and it was Nafi. And he said, "Nafi, what are you doing?" And he said, "Imam, I can't let you go out in the battlefield. Maybe someone will come and attack you." And he said, "Okay, if you want to come with me." And so the Imam would go here and there, and he would clear some branches, and he would clear some shrubs here and there. And Nafi would ask him, "What are you doing here?" And he says, "Here I'm just clearing it because here is where my nephew will fall on the ground and he will be cut to pieces, so I don't want him to be hurt by this." And then he took him a further place and he said, "Here is a place. Again, I'm cleaning this because this is where one of my brother's arms will fall here." He takes him further and says, "This is where another arm of my brother's will fall here." And he takes him through again and again. And we know the famous thing is, which is that the poet says this, that at one point Nafi says, "Imam, I can hear a woman crying." And Imam says, "Nafi, I think it's best if you go back from here, because this is where I will go in my final prostration. And the woman who's crying is my mother, Fatima Zahra." Inna Allahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Sayalamu alladhina zalamu ayya munqalibin yanqalibun. Matam Hussain.
आबाद हुई करबो बला, उजड़ा मदीना बर्बाद हुई मैं। आबाद हुई करबो बला, उजड़ा मदीना बर्बाद हुई। ज़ैनब को न रसाया मुहर्रम का महीना, बर्बाद हुई मैं। आबाद हुई करबो बला, मदीना बर्बाद हुई मैं। आबाद हुई करबो बला, उजड़ा मदीना बर्बाद हुई। एक दिन था कि इस शहर की करती थी मैं शाही, और आज तबाही, और आज مجتبائی بے غسل پڑا مہر نبوت کا نگینہ برباد ہوئی میں آباد ہوئی کربلا اجڑا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں کس لاش پہ روؤں کس چھوڑوں میں برادر لاشیں ہیں 72 لاشیں ہیں 72 حد یہ ہے کہ رونے کی اجازت بھی ملی نہ برباد ہوئی میں آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا مجرا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجڑا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں اصغر کا گلا بھائی کسر سینہ اکبر سب گوہر و چادر سب گوہر و چادر اس دشت میں لوٹا گیا زینب کا خزینہ برباد ہوئی میں آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجڑا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجڑا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں مائیں بھی نہ پہچان سکی بچوں کے چہرے بکھرے ہوئے سہرے بکھرے ہوئے سہرے ہے خون کے دریا میں بہا ہے خون کے دریا میں غریبوں کا سفینہ برباد ہوئی میں آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجڑا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجڑا مدینہ برباد ہوئی ایک آگ ہے خیموں میں قیامت کا سما ہے غازی تو کہاں ہے غازی تو کہاں ہے دیکھو تو ردا چھین گیا شمر کمینہ برباد ہوئی میں آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجڑا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میں آباد ہوئی کرب و بلا اجڑا مدینہ برباد ہوئی میرا بیمار امام میرا بیمار امام میرا بیمار امام میرا بیمار امام وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا نام زینب کا جو غیروں نے پکارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا لو حسین ابن علی پیاسے ذبح ہونے لگے لو حسین ابن علی پیاسے ذبح ہونے لگے کتنا شرمندہ وہ دریا کا کنارہ ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا وہ گرا زین سے زینب کی ردا کا ضامن وہ گرا زین سے زینب کی ردا کا ضامن کون اب فاطمہ جائی کا سہارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا سارے میدان میں تو جانے تو لگا ہے اصغر سارے میدان میں تو جانے تو لگا ہے اصغر کس طرح تیرے بنا ماں کا گزارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا نوک نیزا پہ بہانے لگے آنسو مولا نوک نیزا پہ بہانے لگے آنسو مولا پھر سکینہ کو کسی شخص نے مارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا وقت سجاد نے کیسے وہ گزارا ہوگا یا حسین 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 یا حسین
السلام عليك يا رسول الله السلام عليك يا نبي الله السلام عليك يا خاتم النبيين وسيد المرسلين السلام عليك وعلى ابنتك فاطمة الزهراء سيدة النساء العالمين السلام عليك وعلى وصيك وخليفتك أمير المؤمنين علي بن أبي طالب السلام عليك وعلى ولديك الحسن والحسين سيدا شباب أهل الجنة السلام عليكم وعلى 9 المعصومين من ذرية الحسين السلام عليك يا مولانا يا صاحب الزمان السلام عليك يا خليفة الرحمن السلام عليك يا شريك القرآن السلام عليك يا قاطع البرهان السلام عليك يا إمام الإنس والجان. السلام عليك وعلى آبائك الطيبين وأجدادك الطاهرين المعصومين ورحمة الله وبركاته. صلوات.